I am fundamentally an optimist, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the problems. We know the problems in India. All of us in this room read about it. We know where the doing business rankings are and so on. Okay, we are going to try and give this a positive spin. And over the last day and this morning, I was trying to count if there's any speaker at this conference who has not mentioned Make in India somewhere in their speech. Now, I didn't listen to Karan Johar. I don't know if he mentioned it or not, but pretty much everybody in some way or the other has talked about Make in India. And I think it is really, in many ways, one of the central themes around the success of this government, if this government is going to be successful. So let me ask you all a question. Have you touched anything in the last 48 hours that was made in China?
Yes.
Yes?
Everything.
Okay? Everything, right? What about made in India besides Indian food? You won't go there, okay? How many of you have touched anything made in India? Far fewer people, right? Maybe 15, 20%. Okay. One of the questions in the panel is, can India do this? Okay. So my first question before that is, what is India already doing that is world class in manufacturing? Anybody tell me? Textiles. Okay. What else? Automobiles. Pharmaceuticals. Okay. So. Some of you are younger than 30, so you probably don't take very many medications, but I've asked Dr. Raghi to help me here. Can you tell me where this medication was? Who makes this one?
So this is Aurobindo.
Aurobindo.
Yeah.
Okay. And this one?
And this is Lupin.
Okay. Both Aurobindo and Lupin Pharma are Indian companies, and if you take generic medication of any kind, okay, I didn't specially select these, okay, these are just my regular meds, I'll take them to demonstrate in a few minutes, okay, proof, India really leads the world in generic pharma, and soon there will be innovative products in the pharma business coming out of India. Okay, the same thing is true of automotive and so on, and we can go on and on. But I wanted to establish the baseline that it's not as if India is starting from scratch, and this is not just about India versus China. Okay, why is manufacturing important to India? Okay, let's be very clear about that, and Dr. Raghi may want to add something to that. But people say India is well known for IT and call centers. Okay, but IT and call centers employ 1 million, 2 million, 5, 10 million people. In a population of 1.5 billion, you need something that creates 100, 200, 300 million jobs. And to me, it's only manufacturing that can solve that kind of problem. There's a lot of promise in India around that. We have a terrific panel here, and we're going to make it as interactive as possible. So we have somebody from the aluminum business, we have somebody from the bearing business, we have Dr. Raghi, who's the president of the US-India Business Council, which is an organization of the largest American companies. We have Lou Hutter, our token white guy on the panel. Lou has a really ambitious plan to manufacture semiconductors in India, and he's going to talk about that. So we have a very wide mix. What we are missing on the panel, as you will notice, is any large American company manufacturing in India. Okay, and that's a significant gap. If you heard the Minister of IT talk about this yesterday, FDI is skyrocketing in India, right? You look at the companies, okay, they are from China, Japan, Europe, everything but the United States. Okay, and to me, as I'm a management consultant, I make my living helping American companies do business in India. Unless American companies engage more deeply in this process, Make in India will fail. It will not really succeed. You can't do this through through the company that makes Apple iPhones in China coming to India just so that they can make some more cell phones. The innovative manufacturing, the innovative products have to come from this country. Okay, so I'm really excited to be here, and let's get going here. What I want to do is talk to the audience first. So if any of you have experience in manufacturing in India? A few people do. So do any of you who have experience in India have some questions for the panelists? If you speak loudly, you can speak right from where you are. Otherwise, you can come up to the mic. Or you can pass the mic? Okay. Say your name and your affiliation with India Manufacturing and your question.
Good morning. My name is Prem. I'm from a very middle-class manufacturing background in Coimbatore. Right? It's basically lead shops. They make motors and such like that. I come from a family background like that. So I'm very excited to see the Make in India concept. So this is more of a strategy and a policy question. So the current policy is moving towards a heavy influx in FDI and bringing in companies like Walmart and IKEA and companies like that. How would this help, into a very small business, mom and pop shop based ecosystem that is currently in India? Can we sustain that kind of a model and do similar to Make in India?
So your question is, what will be the role of small companies and what is the impact of this big FDI coming into India?
That is correct. Is it sustainable?
All
Is
right.
it, looking at US, it is
I got
not.
it.
So
you're all, here at HBS, and while I didn't attend HBS, I did spend half a term at IIM Ahmedabad, and I was taught, one thing I remember from that half a term is brevity. Okay, so just get to your question. You don't have to introduce your question. Okay, so who else wants to ask a question? Yes, young lady there.
So my family business is in the steel industry, and the condition of the steel industry is really bad currently in India. So what are some of the sectors that you would suggest to diversify as a business?
What sectors to diversify if you're an Indian company manufacturing in India?
In steel.
Okay, all right, got it. All righty. Yes, sir, right here.
Abhinav here. I was working for Tata Motors back in India as part of the Nano project, and we had to move our plant from Singur to Ahmedabad. So with the Make in India and all the plan and strategy, when the companies are coming, what government is doing for the land reform and to make sure that such kind of things will happen again.
Land reform, okay. And is this a question about the central government or the 29 state governments?
Even if the central government is doing something, there are so many regional parties right now, they contradict with each other and they want to gain political advantage. So definitely there is a conflict between those
Okay.
two.
All right, got it. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions before we get started. One from here.
How will Make in India stop every other engineer from being a software engineer?
Yes. Got it. And that's an interesting question. We'll hear from the panel and then I have a take on it if you have time at the end. Okay, let's go to the lady over there.
What are some of the key watch-outs for U.S. companies who are looking to produce in India?
Watch out for it, U.S. companies, okay. All righty. And right here in the front row.
I'm Abraham. So my question is that if you want to really scale up on manufacturing, you need skilled workers, and that itself will take a lot of time. So how do you intend to balance the two requirements?
Skilled workers, yes, huge issue. And several speakers have addressed it in their talks as well. Okay, I have to say the questions from the audience are brilliant. And we'll dispose of all our own material based on this. Yes, right there.
I want to ask about manufacturing energy in India, nuclear power, especially in the basis for manufacturing anything.
Nuclear power specifically. Are other people interested in nuclear power here? A few are, okay, good. Okay, and I can take that if nobody on the, Many of these questions I know Mukesh can answer, but we want to divide them up equally here, so, okay. Alrighty. One more, last one.
So you mentioned that Lou Hutter was very optimistic about manufacturing semiconductors in India. How do you propose to get past the critical infrastructure challenges like 24-hour power, water?
Yeah, okay. So Lou has a short presentation, so he's going to address that. Alrighty, I think we got enough to get us going, and so let's see. I began my career in manufacturing in India. I graduated from IIT Kanpur, and we have one other IITian on the panel. I'll let you look at the bios to figure out who. And worked for Larsen & Toubro in Bangalore in manufacturing. And then my first job in the US was also in manufacturing. And then, like so many other people, I've moved into areas outside of manufacturing. But I am really, really excited about what's happening now with this Make in India initiative. Earlier, or middle of last year, I wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review on understanding the rise of manufacturing in India. So we won't cover a lot of those points here. You can find that online and get some of the ideas from my thinking in that article. So let's start briefly by talking about Make in India for the world rather than Make in India for India. Okay, it's clear that if the Indian government imposes very high tariffs, that people who want to sell to the Indian market will set up a factory there. That's a no-brainer. But to me, that's a tax on the Indian population for inefficient manufacturing. Why make things in India that you could make cheaper in China only so that the Indian government can fund the salaries of its employees? Okay, so that's, I first want to focus on manufacturing in India that can be sold worldwide. Okay, and I'd like to go, and see which of our panelists would like to address that. Would you like to start, Satish?
Yeah, I think, I'll just take up one point there. I mean, it is in some ways wrong to say that if it can be done cheaper in China, then necessarily India should not be doing those manufacturing things. And I'll give you a good example in aluminium or anything. US today, US and Canada use about 6 million tons of aluminium, which they use in cars, automotives. And the state of the aluminium industry in the US has got to the point where they make less than 1 million tons of aluminium. So anytime that there is an upswing in that price of aluminium, the US manufacturers are going to be tremendously exposed to it. So that's one point where any country needs to take a very strategic look at what is important to their economy, and you cannot outsource everything to another country. So that's my first point. The second point is you have to remember that competing with China, as we have realized, whether it's the steel industry that the young lady mentioned, or the aluminium industry or any other industry, the Chinese government gives a vast amount of subsidies to make its industry grow, whether it's power, whether it's infrastructure, whether it is land. And when you compare Indian manufacturing to Chinese manufacturing, it will be wrong to say, oh, it's made cheaper in China, so let's shut down all the Indian manufacturing industry. I think the big part that the government is realizing is that competition in this type of world has to be on an even plane. So if the power costs, if the land costs and all that inputs are in the same level, then yes, I personally believe that India actually has a tremendous advantage in manufacturing. And I think that, costs in China can only go up, and they are going up. And I think that the time for India to be a manufacturing superpower is actually right now.
Excellent. I think Shishir may have a comment on that. I know he's got a strong point of view on this.
So, should we make in India for India or outside India? And I think that's the question of what's the value that one company can create around its offering. It's nothing to do whether I sell in India, I compete with China. The world is what it is. Chinese government will do what it's to do for Chinese business. The China-based companies will do what's good for them. And I think as companies that are based in India, whether they're multinationals or Indian companies, Indian origin companies, they need to find their own footing and say, this is what I compete with. And I'll give a very simple example. So 15 miles from my factory in Pune, where we make bearings, and we've been doing for the last 50 years now. We make the bearings and we send them all the way to Europe. They get fitted into a power transmission system, and they come back 15 miles away from my factory to be fitted in a car. This is the new supply chain. 15 miles away from my factory, and I supply it across the Europe and still comes back, and it is still competitive. I think the key issue is what value do we create? And there are businesses in India which are creating value, and it doesn't matter what segment you are, whether you're a hospital, whether you are an airline, whether you are a bearing company, aluminium company, steel company, it doesn't matter. It depends on what is the value you are defining, what value you create for your customers, and if you can do that, word is the market.
Excellent. I think Lou has a few slides that he'd like to show us. This might be a good time to do that.
Sure, okay.
You want to?
Okay. Is this on? I'm just going to spend a little bit of time, just a few minutes, to give a few perspectives on Make in India. Just to frame the problem, this is kind of a good news, bad news story. If you look at India, the electronics market in India is growing 12% a year. That's good news. The bad news is that almost all of that's imported, and roughly $86 billion last year. If you look at the projections, it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 billion in 2030. It's going to blow past oil. It'll be the single biggest import that India has, and pretty clearly that's an unsustainable amount of imports. So if you look at manufacturing and you want an imperative, there it is. Okay? You cannot sustain importing that much on a regular basis. What we're trying to do is proposing establishing a wafer fab in India, focusing on analog and power, and I can talk more about that later, why that is. We want to use that fab to be a catalyst. The idea is to build and accelerate an Indian electronics ecosystem that creates a supply chain. Shishir was just talking about supply chain in his industry. India needs a supply chain in the electronics industry. And that can drive, over time, significant economic value, jobs, and reduce imports. So I've been in India going regularly for about 17 years. The last 2 years on this project, I've been there probably 50% of my time, and so I have a few observations. Things that Americans should know about India. India is not China, so things that may work in China may not necessarily work in India. India is not monolithic. It's not one just country. It's really a series of states. And in that respect, it's more like the EU than it is the US. So you can't think of it that way. It has the potential to be a global supplier with low cost. I mean, that's why we're there. We think we can be a great wafer foundry in India. But it's got infrastructure challenges. One of the gentlemen asked about that. Water and power. And if you're a semiconductor guy, that's what you live and breathe on. It's getting better, but there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. India is not a Me Too culture. It's a land of entrepreneurs. And so this is a good thing. And if you look at a recent Harvard study, India is projected to be the number one GDP growth of any country in the world. It's a decade of India. So the time is right for manufacturing in India. So what should Indians know about Make in India? Well, firstly, electronics manufacturing is happening. It's ramping up, but there's a lot more that can be done. There's a program called MSIPS, which is Modified Special Incentive Program scheme that's by the central government. It's been very helpful to try to drive supply chain, but it's usually for the lower value side of the supply chain. The higher value parts of the supply chain need more incentives from the government to compete. If you look at other countries in Asia, they see wafer fabs, for instance, my space, as great plums, and they go after them aggressively with upfront incentives and so forth. So, I think the Indian government needs to decide, is this a strategic industry? And if it is, they need to get after it aggressively, because other countries are already in the game and working, I'd say, maybe harder. Infrastructure. I think India needs to focus on infrastructure, build that up first, then go after FDI, maybe not the other way around. Okay, it's like, I was joking that FDI to me stands for fixed infrastructure. And so, frankly, the world doesn't care if India has manufacturing. Okay, honestly speaking. Right now, India is a great consumer So other countries love shipping products into India, okay? So don't do manufacturing in India. Other countries will love you, okay? And you can just keep paying the bills. So if you want to reverse that trend, somebody needs to put manufacturing in India, and that needs a lot of help. It's an Indian problem, needs Indian solution, and NRIs around the world really need to step up. This is an opportunity really to help make that happen. Okay, so I'll turn it back to the panel.
Okay, thanks so much, Lou. So the point that struck me most about Lou's slides was the phrase that the world doesn't really care if India succeeds in manufacturing. And I wish there was a way that we could drill this into all the people making decisions in India today. You know, the amount of online advertising and billboards you see for Make in India Week that's coming up, okay, mostly focused in India on Indians, many of whom will not necessarily make any, decisions affecting this. We have become very good in India at PR and maybe at Twitter and Facebook, but really, what will make 100 people like Lou want to do what he's doing? Lou is from Texas. I lived in Texas, and I can sense the Texas DNA making you go fight this challenge and hopefully succeed. What I'd like to do now is ask each of the panelists to talk for a couple of minutes about the positive side of it, about what is easy to do in India, what can we do really well in India, what are India's strengths. I don't know if you can start, perhaps Satish.
Okay, so I think from the positive side, the first thing is fairly clear to everyone is that you have a huge market. So for any manufacturing business, which is all about creating thousands and millions of one thing, the market is one big advantage. I think the second thing that you will see is attracting and getting a fairly educated workforce at very competitive prices compared to anywhere in the world. So having that manpower dividend is also one of the big advantages that we have in manufacturing. And I think that the third thing that's happening, which is probably one of the biggest tailwinds to manufacturing in India, is the rapid urbanization that's taking place. And as you urbanize and as you get more and more people moving into the cities and the consumer goods demands and all going up, I think this is going to provide a huge tailwind to manufacturing in India. So these, I think, I'll leave some more for the others, but this is what I would pick as the strong points of manufacturing in India.
Okay. Mukesh?
Well, let me give you a macro perspective on Make in India and why it is important for India itself. By 2028, India will have 1.46 billion people, number one populated country in the world. Next 20 years, India has to create approximately 100 million jobs. And the agriculture sector cannot sustain that, nor can services sector, because services today is around 55% of the total GDP. And manufacturing becomes one of the potential answer for India to solve this issue about creating jobs for 100 million people itself. And I think you have to understand that if you look at trend in manufacturing, in the 50s, US economy, when it was peaking on the manufacturing side, almost 50% of GDP was manufacturing. In the 60s, when Japan embarked on the journey to make in Japan, almost 40% of the GDP moved into the scenario itself. And if you look at Korea, in the 70s embarked on manufacturing, almost 30% of its GDP was in manufacturing. And if you look at China, at its peak time, basically was slightly below 25% of GDP on manufacturing. The objective of the government today is to take India currently from 15% to 25% to GDP. And you have to understand the trend last 10 years have been that India's manufacturing section of the GDP has come down from 16 to 15%. So I'm just trying to put down hard, cold facts on the table. The question is what are the three things or two things we need to do, as India needs to do, to really take off of manufacturing? One is, as mentioned earlier, infrastructure. If you look at the average goods movement around the world on a truck, is roughly 500 kilometers a day. India does around 250 kilometers a day. That has to move up. If you take a ship being unloaded at an Indian port, it takes 4 days to unload a ship. And when you go to Hong Kong or Singapore, it takes 10 hours. The wage, we talked about wages going in China. Today, China's wage rate on a manufacturing labor on an hourly basis is $3.52. India is 92 cents. But we lose that productivity advantage because of infrastructure issues. So we need to fix that. I think the second factor I would say is on the ease of doing business. I think India today has moved from 142 World Bank ranking to 130.
What's easy? I want to encourage the audience here.
No, which is fine. Let me just tell you a couple of our members which have basically set up plants in India. Ford set up a plant in India. The day they broke the ground and they got into manufacturing, it was the fastest plant they built anywhere in the history or anywhere in the world. So it's doable. Another example I would give is Abbott. Abbott has roughly around 14,000 employees in India, does roughly around $1.5 billion in revenue in India, and they have become total supply chain in the global environment. And I think the key thing, if you look at both Ford and Abbott, is they hung on early on and persevere with some of the issues. But I think the challenge is going to be, Gunjan, is we got to fix this ease of doing business, because I have today, if I look at my member company, and I'll close on that note, we have roughly $41 billion worth of investment waiting to move to India from member companies in the next 12 to 24 months. But we need to fix some issues, and that's what we need to focus on.
So, I want to dwell on one point a little bit. We are assuming that government is the answer. And sitting here on the campus of the Harvard Business School, I'm a little uncomfortable suggesting that government is the answer.
No, it is not.
The government wasn't the answer when the IT business in India was being built. They haven't the foggiest idea what Infosys and TCS and others were up to.
Absolutely.
I don't think the government was the answer when banks in India started to modernize, and we have Chanda Kochar here in the audience. ICICI did a remarkable thing and now you see banks like State Bank scrambling to catch up. Okay. These things weren't really driven by government policy. And, with people in the audience here, I want to see, what can we do today, given the PR campaign of, the Narendra Modi government is great, They hired Whedon plus Kennedy, an American ad agency, to create that ad campaign, and it's fabulous. But the next level down in terms of action, people are talking about land reform and so on, which we'll get to. Many things are not happening perhaps there. But still, I think entrepreneurs and companies can start to make things happen. And I'm curious, your example about Ford is terrific. Are there other companies like that who are ready to do something in India?
So Gunjan, let me just jump in. So 98 of the Fortune 100 are already in India. So we are not talking of an economy where is out jungle out there and you need to start cleaning it from the base. So, and all of them are manufacturing in one way or other. The bigger question is, I think, to what was said is, can we continue to be, how much can we afford to import going forward and in which dimension? And therefore, where should the investment go? And I think that's where I will bring the biggest advantage India has got, and that's low cost innovation. I think India has got this super ability to innovate at a very, very low cost. And this is now being discovered by many. And this is where the US companies are leading, and therefore I pick this example. For example, GE in medical healthcare has discovered that India can be the cradle for low-cost innovation for affordable medical care. We were talking about that in the earlier morning today as well. That's one example, yeah. When I look at my own company, why is it that the whole world bearing production is not moving to India? And then, of course, there are other dimensions beyond the first cost, as I call it, yeah. The quality, the nearness to customer, the culture, the customization requirements. There are many dimensions that will go into it. So I think, and you said it in passing remark, I think two industries where India is already world class, which we don't much talk about in manufacturing segment today. One is IT. We are really world class on IT services, and the banking segment is like anywhere in the world. Yeah, these are two industries. You said government or no government, but there's been big government presence in banking, but even they started to change once the private segment came in, led by people like Chanda and her other colleagues in the segment. So we have a robust financial segment, and I personally believe at the end of the day, we are still a good democracy. So there is a land of the law. So when you are coming as an investor, that's something that you want, that there is some law which is independent of government, which you can go to in case of a trouble.
There's another point that you and I talked over dinner last night, is that your company has been in India 50 years, and you've raised capital in India. So FDI is not so important to your business. You're actually raising money on the Indian markets and from sales in India. And that's one way I think also that India stands out from China, where you can do a lot of local capital raises to make things happen. I want to get to the audience questions very quickly. So very briefly, I'd like for each of you to address perhaps just one state in India that if you think over the last we know what the state was before, what the status was prior to the Narendra Modi government taking power. But since then, over the last 2 years, can you pick one state in India that has made substantial improvement in its ability to welcome manufacturing? And if you want to skip that, that's fine too. Yeah.
Sure. My vote would go for Madhya Pradesh. We have seen a very proactive stance by that state in terms of really understanding the value of having electronic manufacturing and partnering, being creative, trying to think outside the box, to use that kind of cliche or whatever, but really being a partner with us to establish that capability in their state. They realize what it can mean for them, but we've talked to many states, and a lot of people talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And MP has been at it with us for a year and a half, and I've come to really appreciate them as a partner in this. And really, when you're trying to do something big, you need the state, you need government to be a partner. And so I'm very pleased with the support we've gotten there.
Satish, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, one perspective when you ask that question of the states, you have to realize is that if India has to develop as a worldwide economy, number 2, number 3 in the world, we cannot just have the what I would call the coastal states doing well. So it cannot be just Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, which is where all the sort of most of the manufacturing has been. The heartland states are the ones that have got a huge part of our population. Majority of the natural resources are lying in those states. And this is where the Make in India has to work, not in Gujarat and not in Maharashtra. I think they're doing quite well. So actually, when you look at it, and you look at the World Bank index that was just published, and states like Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Jharkhand, MP are the ones that came out towards the top. I know a lot of us felt like, is that really true? Now, I'll tell you, most of our factories are in those states. And I can tell you that, the state governments in those places are putting out a tremendous effort to try to get manufacturing going there. Because otherwise what happens is that your natural resources just get mined and shipped out, and that there is no benefit to the state where those natural resources are. So I am not surprised, because even in Madhya Pradesh, we put up a huge aluminium smelter and downstream plant. But really in these states, there seems to be quite a new awakening on the need to attract manufacturing because they give jobs. As he said, today there are 60 million jobs in manufacturing. If India's GDP goes 25% in manufacturing, you will add another 60 to 70 million jobs. And I think it's those heartland states, those need those jobs. Otherwise, everybody is going to come and sit in Bombay.
Just to add a point, I think if you're living in India, if I see last 18 months, the biggest change that I see is that the states are competing with each other for attracting investment. That's been the biggest change, in my opinion, where an incoming industrialist or investment is now being chased by many, saying, "Come, I'm happy to have you in my state." And that is what has given rise to these differences. I set up a factory at the same time in Ahmedabad and another one in Haridwar. Now, normally, for those of us from India, when you say Haridwar, you go to Haridwar for a different purpose. It's only towards the end of your life when you want to wash away all your sins. But we set up that factory, and I can tell you based on our experience that if we fix the infrastructure, there is no difference in Gujarat versus Haridwar. Absolutely no difference. The government was equally hospitable, the people are equally talented, the supply chains do get established. Once you are there, your suppliers will come to you, because when you see business, you start to establish that. So that's not the problem. The problem is getting to and fro from there, and that is still a problem. But that is a big question, and I think that's where I go to what Lau said, that the FDI means fix the infrastructure. This is, and I'm recalling a little bit, at that time, Ms. Modi was not the Prime Minister, he was CM, and I was setting up a factory in China at that time for my previous job. And he was addressing in China. And he said, the question in my mind is, do I do like China, which has made the infrastructure and then invited in people, or like in the way the Indians do, is we think the infrastructure comes second. And he said, that's where the big challenge, a change in thinking of the government has to come about. And as we sit here, I know, because my company does serve that segment in a very big way, from a very snail speed of 3 kilometers of road building per day. There is an ambitious target of 30, but I don't care. Even if it goes to 15, we have 5-fold increase in road building per day. At its peak, the world's best has been 20. So even if we touch 21, I keep on saying this, that for us, it's not a question of if it will happen. For India, the question is when it will happen.
Gunjan, one thing which we have missed in our discussion is make in India, especially in the generics. I think the Indian manufacturing generics have taken the lead in every aspect. In fact, if you look in the US environment, almost 30% of the generics are coming from India itself. And we did a study that 30% is saving almost $20 billion for US government from the Medicare perspective itself.
Could be 40 billion if healthcare really worked right.
Yeah.
So it's, if there's been a big difference with the Modi government, I think it is this competition among the states and the rise of the heartland states, because I think that's crucial. I agree, in terms of success. So let's get to the questions from the audience, starting with, the government seems to be after FDI from large sources. How should a small Indian business, small Indian manufacturer be looking at this, and what can be done to help them? You probably have many suppliers in your business, and I'm sure, Shishir, you do as well. So from that perspective, what do you think Make in India means, and how can they benefit?
So, yes, we have a host of small-scale suppliers, and I would say our growth is also equally dependent on how they grow. We can't grow independent of their capabilities and capacities. So obviously and a lot of investment is going, this is something that the big companies have understood, that we need to invest back into our supply chain, into their development and their future and their works and their processes. So I think there's a lot of work that is going on around there. There is a lot of India's NSDC program for skill development is an absolutely hallmark program, in my opinion, where government has recognized the need for this, and I think all of this skill building will go towards enhancing the level of operations for small and medium scale. Yes, the people who operate small and medium scale also have to understand that the world is changing, so it cannot be run like quote-unquote mom and pop shop. The rules of the engagement for mom and pop shops have changed. So they have to retain some of the good part of theirs, but then on some of the dimensions they need to change.
Okay, the next question we had was about, if you have a steel manufacturing facility, where do you want to diversify? And I'll let you take that, Satish.
Steel, aluminum, any of the metals, actually the answer is fairly obvious, because why do we do steel or aluminum in India? Because we have some of the largest iron ore or bauxite reserves. So I think that, getting those reserves and making what I would call the primary metal is really not taking full advantage of the value chain. So very obviously what you need to do is to go up the value chain from steel or aluminum to the next round of value-added products. Because this is where the technology comes in, this is where the value of the product itself is taken up. So aluminum, whether it's cars, whether it's a defense sector for India. So steel, aluminum, all these will benefit if we don't stop at just extract the ore, take out the metal, and then send it somewhere else, as he was saying, to Europe and then bring it back to India. I think the downstream part of value-added products in India is where we should diversify. In fact, Hindalco, we have set up with a $5 billion investment, the huge upstream part, and now most of our strategy is adding value-added products to that.
Are you going to be making any more acquisitions in the US to support that?
I think our Novelis, which is a $11 billion revenue acquisition, is an answer there, because if you look at the growth of aluminium in the US, it's all in automotive because of the lightweighting and the CAF rules. And then it's aeronautics. And then in India, believe it or not, most of the defense stuff is where all the aluminium used there is imported into India. So whether it's the missiles, whether it's the fighter jets, whether it's the submarines, these are all aluminium alloys. So I think that's a tremendous place for us to diversify up the value chain.
I might just mention that you might want to consider diversifying into the electronics area.
And just to add a point, so just so that if you think, so today we buy a lot of steel. Everything that we make is made out of steel. And still I don't get all the steel that I want in India. I still have to import. So if you're a steel maker, you want to see what value added steel you want to make.
The higher alloys and... Yeah.
Okay, then we had a question from the former Tata Motors employee about land reform. And Mukesh, do you want to take a stab at that? I know your members are very keen to make that happen.
I think it's a complex legislative issue. And I think Modi government has decided that it's not worthwhile pushing it from the central side. And I think going state by state is the way to go. And I think we're looking at state like Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. They have taken the lead in this area. So I think the trend we see is states which will take the lead on labor and land reform will attract more investment itself. And that competitive spirit is picking up in India itself.
Just one thing to add on land, because, I have had the pleasure or whatever you call of trying to deal with all the land issues that when we have a 3,500 hectares project, and you cannot imagine after 5 years we are still trying to buy out the last 50 acres, negotiating one by one. So I think that, the good news is you have to look at it and say we are a democracy. We don't do like the Chinese government did, which is just go and take over the land. And, there is a due process. But it is true, and I seriously think that what can hold back Indian manufacturing after infrastructure will be availability of land. And it's interesting, you go to some of the heartland states and you will find that the people that you're buying the land from are second or thrice displaced already. So, they have already been displaced for one project and then you're buying the land for the next project. So it's like a cottage industry being displaced there. But land, India is a big country, but we have a lot of people as well. So there is not much free land. And hence, I think this land, as you said, state by state, they're making land banks. But this is a very critical part besides infrastructure. And the one thing that we have not talked about, which is power, these three are the ones that will make the difference.
So is Piyush Goyal, the new, the current power minister, is he really making a significant impact on the energy situation? You consume more energy probably than any of the rest, probably all of us put together.
Yeah. It's interesting. We run 3,500 megawatts of captive power. And most people who are in the aluminium business, when they come in, they say, why don't you just connect to the grid? Why do you run your own power plants? That's the first obvious question we get asked. But I'll tell you one thing. I think it's great that the government is very focused on providing power. It's really great that they have a big renewable push. But I'll tell you one thing. For manufacturing to take off, solar and wind is not going to work. It's just not going to give you the gigawatts at the consistency that you need. That's why the lady who just mentioned nuclear, I really think that if India wants to first reduce its carbon emissions and wants to diversify away from coal, I really think we should go in a much bigger way into nuclear, because I have looked personally at the heat maps of putting up solar. The PLFs, or the plant load factors, are maximum 20. You cannot run a full-scale manufacturing plant It's a good, energy has to be seen as a portfolio, like your investment portfolio. So you need to have 20-25% renewables. You need to have everything else. But I think for India to be big in manufacturing and you want to get away from coal, nuclear, I personally think is probably the best option we have.
That's a subject really close to my heart, and since many people in the audience have expressed interest, let's talk about that a little bit. We have the Nuclear Power Corporation of India running 20 plants across the country, producing altogether across those, I think something like 5,000, 6,000 megawatts. One Anil Ambani plant in Madhya Pradesh will produce that much from coal, right? They've been talking since 2008 when George Bush and Manmohan Singh signed the treaty, the 123 agreement. We were all very hopeful that we will have the plants from Westinghouse and GE and Areva and so on. So far, not one American company has made one solitary cent on nuclear power, even though we produce more nuclear power in this country than any country in the world. Mukesh, do you have some thoughts on when we will see a real check being written from India to Westinghouse or GE or anybody?
Well, we have a nuclear summit taking place March 31st. Prime Minister is coming to the US. Last week, India signed the liability issue. Yeah. So we feel that Westinghouse will be the first one to sign. It'll sign something before March 31st because there was a commitment between the Prime Minister and President Obama. But just to answer your question, I think India is planning to have 60 nuclear plants in the next 5 years. They will only generate 5% of the total capacity. So you're right, nuclear plant is not the answer. We have to look at some other scenario from a manufacturing perspective also.
Let me just make a comment. I'm not a nuclear person, but India generally on average is an energy deficit country. There's a lot of work going on, coal, nuclear, solar, others, to try to raise the power status, and that's a good thing. On the other hand, there is opportunities galore in India to conserve energy in the products that are built and bought every single day. One of the most ubiquitous things you can see in India is a ceiling fan. Okay, these things and these things leak energy unbelievably. Okay, so the point is that there's the electronics industry can make a huge contribution to reducing some of the number of power plants that need to be built over time by building products for India that can use the same kind of energy power management that you see in other places around the world. So it's a balancing act. We need more power, but we also need to conserve more power. So there's opportunities on both sides of the ledger.
Excellent. We have only 1 minute left, so let me focus on the one important question. We're not covering all of them here, but skilling the workforce. Okay, who wants to take that?
Nice. So, we employ 50,000 people in Hindalco in India alone. And one of the real issues is that everybody wants an engineering graduate degree. To the point that, you can get an engineering degree from colleges that you have never heard of, and the people, when they finally show up, really don't know anything about engineering. But if you actually look at manufacturing, the biggest hole that we have is in electricians, is in welders, is in machinists. This is the skill bank that the government, I think, now has finally caught on. Because I don't think they should focus on, I'm from IIT, but we don't need another 10 IITs or another 20 MBA houses in India. We actually need to put most of our energy into vocational training. Because I think this is probably the weakest link that we have in the manufacturing chain.
Just to add to Satish's point, I think there's two big things that are on the horizon now. One is the government's initiative on National Skill Development Program, under which they are encouraging industry to adopt what they believe is their own core area of skill and adopt a village, a district, a place, an ITI, you name it, depending on where you are, and help build those skills that you think are required for tomorrow's industry. That's number one. And I think number two, which is equally important, building on what you said, is the whole idea about the CSR program spend, which is now made mandatory in India, where corporations are told that 2% of their profits must go to build, and skill development is a very important element in that part. So a lot of corporates are now doing this, that they are investing part of their profit back into skill development, and I think these are two things that will change, because it's a small thing, but in India everything gets multiplied a billion times. So then you start to do the math, it suddenly start to show up in a big way.
Excellent, thank you. Well, how about a round of applause for this wonderful panel?